You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's Thursday, October 10th, 2024 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific. I think it's still daylight time. Means we get up in the dark at this point. And tonight I thought I would talk about uh, uh, activating the creative self or causing the creative sense of self to arise. Um, in the attachment lens, of course, the toggle that we're really talking about is the activation of the attachment system, which causes you to abandon exploration and seek physical proximity to somebody who you feel will protect you and comfort and soothe you. And in order to get the exploration system to turn back on, you need to get the attachment system to turn off. They're linked. And in some sense, if you can get the attachment system to turn back on, the exploration systems turn back on. So you have the capacity then to leave that secure base and adventure out into the world and begin to discover the things that you need to know. But that still isn't quite the same thing as then this creative sense of self that arises when you can pull out of the way all of the obstacles that the mind tends to throw up to prevent you from doing all of the sense of self-doubt that might come up, and the sense of preferences that might come up as you discern one thing from another through that lens of meaning. Um, because of the way that we create the sense of reality and the uh, the process of that unfolding, you have the capacity to sense something when it has contact with an object that can be sensed by that capacity. A consciousness of that experience arises. It's still before the self experience. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter whether we ever get to it? Is there time for a pleasant experience? And then it's compared to the perceptual database, that storehouse of meaning that we have uh, from the experiences that we've already had. And in that process of attaching meaning, that whole thread of meaning, which is really identified by the collection of sense experiences or mind moments in the present moment, what attaches to that is a whole thread of meaning, and some of those threads go all the way back to the very beginning of life. And in that is also the expectation for the outcome of what's going to happen. And we can get into these ruts of conditioning. Samsara is the word, where because of our anticipation of the outcome, we don't take certain avenues, and kind of an avoidance of the anticipated outcome. And then, of course, depending on what your attachment conditioning is and how that habit of creation of the present moment unfolds, you have different ways of responding to it. So imagine for a second that your caregivers were sensitively attuned to you. They responded to you more than 30% of the time in a way that was useful to you, and you developed a secure sense of attachment. Then what likely is to happen there is that you have the expectation that people will be supportive of the things that are interesting to you, have the expectation that people will listen to you as you describe the experience of discovering what's meaningful to you. You have the sense that not only will they listen to you, but they'll be delighted that you've expressed that to them. And they'll be encouraging you for you to do more. And in that space, that sense of the creative self easily arises because there's a sense of confidence that I can explore, I can discover the things I need to know, I can express them to people that are interested in me, interested in what I've found out, and in that arising of this confident sense of self that can engage in the process of discovery, endure the likelihood that most avenues of discovery won't lead to much. This is one of the great difficulties of exploration, is developing sufficient resilience so that you can discover the things that you need to know and that you don't give up before the discovery, and at the same time can carefully discern whether or not an avenue needs more in the way of pursuit, or you can redirect to something else. And in that process of moving from discovery to discovery and the collection of meaning over time, really develop this facility for exploration, which is driven by the sense of reward that you get out of doing it. That making sense? Mudit.
I think we're still setting up that form of expectation, right? Because we are saying that, oh, if this thing doesn't lead to that, is a form of an expectation from the activity, right? From the anticipation of the outcome.
I think that we have an expectation of what will happen. And in the way that you say that, it sounds to me like there's a negative association with expectation, which may not necessarily be there always. If your expectation was that the exploration would be fruitful, and that you would be able to discover the things that you need to know, then the expectation would be one of receiving, one of being burdened. Is that making sense?
So what does exploration being fruitful mean exactly?
Well, because we're all so unique and our conditioning is also also unique, the thing that really will be valuable to you is probably going to be very specific to you. And the things that I value are going to be specific to me. And so I often think that it is the actual specifics that are less interesting than the unfolding of how to discover what you need to know, because you could use the understanding of the process of exploring for your own exploration without having to arrive at the specifics that are meaningful to me. So, for instance, if I were to talk about photography a little bit, when I started to take pictures of trees, the initial impetus of that was to make a formal portrait of a tree, but use the constraints of portraiture for humans and apply that to the subject of a tree. And so I began to do that. But in the way that visual art works, of course, is you make a visual representation of something and then you examine the visual representation that you made, and in the exploring that begin to discover the parts of it that work for you and the parts that don't work. And then when you go to make the next image, you exclude the parts from the creation of the image that did not work and center it more on the aspects of the image that did work. And then in making the next image, examining the image, and again, understanding the parts of it that work and the parts that of it that don't work. And in this gradual process of distilling what is working, obviously, in my experience of what's working, I find most of the time the subtleties of the images that really get me going are never mentioned by anybody who looks at them. And really, when they relate their experience of the image, they're relating to the meaning that they've assigned to it, not that I've given to it. And so every now and then, when you find somebody that relates to things in the way that you do, that it's close enough that they might actually be talking about the marvelous things that you've put in there that nobody can see except you. It really, there's a zing to that, really. But I can tell you that in the beginning, the tree was central. But if you look at the end of that particular series, what really is happening is an interplay between telephone poles, trees, and streetlights. Because over and over again, the thing that really zinged for me was, in addition to the tree, telephone poles and streetlights. And so whereas the portraits at the beginning are these very sort of straight on pictures of trees, by the end of it, it's this dance between these three elements. And as you move through the landscape looking for what to take a picture of, gradually, as you know what it is that you're actually working with, the locations change, because not all locations have all of the elements that you want, and an absence of the elements that you don't want. This is, a years long process, and a vigorous exploration on my part, but I'm not sure that you would spend 3 years photographing trees, looking for a dance between trees and telephone poles and streetlights. You know what I'm saying?
Mushrooms.
Huh?
I'm on mushroom.
Hard to drive on mushroom. Although, I don't know. I've never taken Christian.
So, George, do you find that people's like the way they see your art in a way that you didn't see it, they end up convincing you, or like how does that, what do you end up with when like here's this work but no one can agree on what it is about it?
Um, no, I don't know that I'm persuaded to a different point of view. The Buddha talked about this as the jewel of Dharma, of course, right? The Dharma is the jewel, but there's all these different facets. And as you look through the facet, each different facet, it creates a different perspective on the Dharma, which is actually enriching of the understanding of things. But what is interesting to me is when you look at a picture and express the meaning of it. So half the series of trees is in color and half the series of the trees is in black and white. And the black and white images are in a very traditional format, and the color pictures are in the golden ratio. Do you know the golden ratio? It's 1.168 realistically, but the golden ratio is supposed to be the dimensions of sight space, really as the origin of it. But then as you look at nature, it repeats over and over again. In that sense, 1 by 1.618. The reason I started to make color pictures is the dealer I had at the time said that younger people cannot look at a black and white photograph without viewing it as a color photograph where the color is muted, which would suggest that it was overcast and gray and cold and desolate, because they don't have the visual literacy of black and white images, because they grew up in an era of color images. But I grew up in an era of black and white images, and for the longest time, color images were entirely garish and unpleasing because of the intensity of the color. And so I haven't lost the capacity to view a black and white image with the full range of emotions, from joyfulness all the way to that melancholy. And maybe you have that or you don't have that. But it's certainly a vocabulary in our culture that has been lost. But now when you're looking at the creation of the visual world, because of the advent of artificial intelligence and all of the tools that are available for creating and distorting imagery, the generation that's currently coming up is shooting black and white film again because they want analog, because they want to be able to represent something as unaltered, which they think that they can do by using film. I don't know if you know your photographers, but Gary Winogrand used to file out the negative holders so that there would be a black border around the image so that he could demonstrate in the way that he presented it that he caught the image without cropping, without altering, which is I always thought of as this ableist view. Right? We those of us who are very slow visual processors who can't snap something and get it right, but can spend 45 minutes setting up the camera to take the picture. Should we really, the genetic advantage, should they be deserving of all of the attention? I would say decidedly they shouldn't. But, how our culture values those things. It's kind of an athleticism in a way.
It's like the hyper realistic drawings where I can draw something as good as a photograph or something.
Or the somebody who's autistic who can look at something once and then draw a detailed drawing 6 feet long in perfect scale. These kinds of advantages. I suppose I have my own set of advantages, and we each do. And then some are valued more than others, which is an interesting thing when we're talking about the activation of the creative self and the fitting that expression into the cultural container that we have. There's a lot of pressure in the cultural container to represent the reality of our society in certain ways, or the relationship of our societies in a certain way. If you take this down a little bit, so culture is the overall container, and society are the groups of people that are dependent on one another for their livelihood and survival. All sorts of different layers of society, living in Los Angeles. And I like to live in these really big places where there's a lot of different societies that are interacting and living within the same culture. It makes it more vibrant, more interesting. And I like the variation of that. I really, the segregated neighborhoods don't really appeal to me because they're too much of the same, and I like the variation. When you activate this creative sense of self, which is really organized around the things that matter to you and the things that you find interesting, and then you go to express them, I really do think that when we talk about this cycle of expression, it is to go out on your own and really go deeply into the things that matter to you and to really understand and integrate the things that matter to you so that you can express them to someone else. And that cycle is really about the gathering of the things, the ingestion of them, and then the expression of them. when you move beyond the society that you're really in to a broader picture of that, and there is some attention to how big of a messenger can you be with the expressions that you make, how does it affect actually the thing that you're exploring? So does it become less about that primary interest thing that really matters to you, and turning more into the secondary exploration, which is a gathering of resources? Adam?
Thanks, George. A couple of questions. One, how important, if at all, do you find it to be to know and understand the why of what matters to you, if that makes sense? And also the line between what you just said. It's the only reason I have a second question, because it was compelling for me that I often find that this desire to express on a mass level the things that matter to me isn't so much for those primary resources as it is, or rather, it's more about the gathering of monetary resources, as opposed to to be honest, attention.
Right. Seeking social status is also secondary exploration, because it provides access to more resources if you can get a higher social status.
Right.
And some, for some people, social status actually has more bite to it than actually remuneration or other kinds of resources, the attention of it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about the activation of the creative self, another way to really talk about it is intermediate and advanced mentalizing. We talk about the basic mentalizing, which really gets you into a place of security where you can support the life that you have, and that you can be in relationship to the people that you need to be in relationship to. And at the top of the stack of the basic mentalizing is meaning making, so that you have a sense of what it is that's meaningful to you. And then as you move into the intermediate range of mentalizing, one of the things that really comes to the fore is the understanding of why you've assigned the meaning to it that you have based on your conditioning, which means that you can reflect on the process of making meaning and understand it. I talk about the 57 T-bird, if you heard me talk about that. In seeing the light flash off the grill of the 57 T-bird, my mind went to a similar flash of light off a chrome surface, but it wasn't a car in the sense of a T-bird. It was the light flashing off the dashboard of my grandmother's car, which was a 53 DeSoto, which was, this was before they padded the dashboards. It was like metal, and chrome, and the knobs for a child's hand took up the whole hand, and the light flashed off of it. And I was with my grandmother, and she was sometimes kind to me, and I grew up in a cruel environment, and so I really equated extraordinary value to expressions of kindness, and that's what came to mind. And so to understand the meaning that you give something is to understand all of the resources that you use to define it, so that you could see clearly, for instance, in that example, that it wasn't the car in the present moment turning the corner that provided that sense of richness and meaning. It was the memory of my grandmother from 40 years earlier that provided that. And so as you move, as you navigate through your exploration and you can mentalize at that level, then you see that more clearly. And as you move then into the advanced mentalizing, where you can see the way the system, for instance, of your society, your immediate society, relates to the systems of a larger society, which relates then to the system of culture, and that you can carry meaning all the way across that, then that's an even richer experience of meaning. And when you can then relate that even beyond the confines of culture to the human condition and the spiritual nature of our life here, then that carries an even deeper, more profound sense of meaning that you could, in your exploration, then certainly this is true in the meditative side of things, go deeply into the nature of the understanding of this human condition, this conundrum that we're in, and find a deep sense of meaning in that, and then express that in a way that is then understandable by the people that you're in society with, which would create a richness in the meaning, so that the greater your capacity at mentalizing these moving parts really at scale, the richer that sense is. I think that making sense, Adam.
Thank you. To help clarify, and this is the meaning I'm assigning to it, obviously, but when I I've heard you tell that story a few times now, and it never gets old. Don't get me wrong, but
It's the problem with having a limited life. You have the same stories.
What I got out of that is, well, one of many things. It's not the car that is giving you the meaning. So
No.
perhaps someone who thought it might be the car, who did not have that capacity to mentalize,
Right.
up buying a car, only to realize I never needed the damn car to begin with. And now I don't
Only to be disappointed.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
How many avenues have been the wrong avenue, right? Which really brings us back to resilience, right? How resilient are you? Can you go up the wrong avenue and really have high hopes that it's going to pay out, and then it doesn't? But what you gather is that it's a misdirection, and so there must be another direction to go in. So for dismissing people where there's great rigidity, the resilience is what's missing, and the pursuit of a wrong avenue is a catastrophe in a way, because they can't flex and then move into a different direction. And for preoccupied people, the problem is that they don't explore very and they don't emotionally regulate independent of other people, so they can't separate from other people to begin to pursue what might be meaningful to them. And as soon as they get dysregulated, of course, the attachment system activates. If they can even get the attachment system to shut down so the capacity for exploration opens, they then still have to be able to mentalize at a higher rate to get the creative self to arise, to know what to do, to have the confidence to try and do it. Disorganized people, particularly as they get older beyond the 20s, really get into a place of preferring social isolation to the experience of being with other people. And that has a terrible impact on exploration, because they don't have this emotionally regulating base to fall back on. So the resilience isn't there. And then also, it so easily turns into auto-regulation, where it really is just distracting and consuming of the time without actually providing much in the way of meaning. This is also true for dismissing people, but if you engage in an activity that's distracting, but it doesn't really lead you to any kind of discovery, and you never actually find a need to express it to anyone else, you're really just in an auto-regulating loop that doesn't provide a sense of meaning. It provides a sense of distraction from the lack of meaning, which means every time you stop distracting yourself, the lack of meaning becomes apparent again. And so you have to go back into the process of distraction to get away from it. And you can consume vast quantities of your very short life caught up in auto-regulating loops. In fact, the whole life can go by and you won't pay attention to it. So as we gather around us, these little societies, these little groups of people that really support us, it's really in that intimate container that these primary explorations can be pursued at a deep level. That's the thing that we organize. And so when you look at the structure of that, what you really are seeing is that in order to be good at exploring, you have to develop your capacity to mentalize so you can discern what it is you're doing. And you need to develop a capacity to emotionally regulate so that you can go explore. But then you also have to develop a safety net, a social safety net, a small group of people that are reliably emotionally regulating that you can show up to, and they will help you come back into balance if your exploration just knocks you sideways. If you don't have that, of course, you won't be able to take the risks that you need to know to really find a depth of meaning. And if you can't find a depth of meaning, it affects the resiliency because there's no upside to balance the disappointment of so many directions that don't really carry you where you need to go. Mudit?
George, can you elaborate on the disappointment of exploration? If it goes sideways, what does that mean exactly?
Well,
I start playing a music instrument, I don't like it. What's the
when you pursue something and it doesn't work, or you attempt to develop something and it doesn't work, there's a quality of disappointment that comes in that. Have you ever heard the expression, the sophomore slump? You know what I mean? It's a phrase that means in the beginning, when you first start something, the gains that you make. So for instance, if we were using a musical instrument, the gains of not being able to play at all to being able to play a little bit are fast and exciting and amazing. But to get from the playing a little bit to playing well is a longer path, which is much harder to do. So that the instant rewards of the successes don't come so much. And it's really the resilience to practice well enough to get beyond that very slow climb in your ability to do it to a place where you suddenly can do it. An instrument wouldn't be one of the things that I did, but when I was in my 20s, I decided that I would learn to throw pots. And so the first few weeks where you center the clay and you make a little pot and you've got this coffee cup that weighs 2 pounds because the walls are so thick, but it looks so beautiful and you're so excited that you could do it. And then hundreds of pots later, hundreds of crappy pots later, you finally get to a place where you can throw a pot, and it's amazing, but it is literally stacking up that enduring that unpleasant, disappointing process to get there. And can you do it? That's what I mean by that. Yeah, making sense.
So not being good at it, but I mean, I can be good at something after 3 years, but then it could be completely meaningless.
Right. I can give you another example. I decided that I would use a Pyro, which is one of the original film processing developers that was developed in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. And the reason that I wanted to use Pyro is because I live in Los Angeles. It's very contrasty here. It's very easy for the spectrum of contrast to exceed the capacity of the film to hold contrast. And when you use Pyro, the development is really slow and long. And when you get good at it, the negatives are amazing, because you could take, say, this may be too technical, but 13 or 15 zones of contrast and condense them down into the 9 that the film can manage. And so when you make a print, it's an amazing range of tonality in a black and white print, which really engages my mind. But it's very tricky. And if you make one mistake, it ruins the negatives, or it streaks them, makes them problematic. So it was years of learning how to get it to work, and then just living with the fact that so many of the negatives were disasters because of it. And every now and then you'd get one that would just work and it would sing, and so that would carry you forward into the next thing. Is that sort of making sense?
Sorry, one thing I'm realizing is that a lot of it is related with me before, like if it's music instrument or photography, it's for me performing for people that really has way more meaning.
Uh-huh.
Is that secondary, or is that also primary?
I don't know. I think that as we resist AI, we're going to be sitting around campfires with guitars singing folk songs again. And so the ability to be able to play with a group of people would be stunning, right? That would be really meaningful. And those moments where it all just sort of comes together in that moment would be remarkable. Yes, and full of meaning.
For the people than me doing it alone. It doesn't have that much meaning, but if I do it for people, then it has. That's fine.
Yes. As long as we're not veering off into secondary, there needs to be the sense of personal satisfaction in the engagement.
I see. Okay. Although
And-
you can get social
Hmm?
get individual satisfaction from status also, so I'm not sure.
Right. Henry.
Hey George, I don't think we've met. I'm Henry.
Hi.
Hey, I had a question. I'm sorry I missed the first couple minutes, so let me know if this is off topic or anything.
Okay.
I was wondering, I guess 2 questions. One is with avoidant people, are people with avoidant style, are they regulating outside of relationship with other people, or distracting, or can it be some of both? And then just in general, for anxious people, like how do we learn to regulate on our own? Like what are good methods for doing that?
So in avoidant people, they tend to be auto-regulators, and they don't really have much in the way of skill in something beyond that. So auto-regulation is engaging in an external activity that's regulating. So, for instance, one of the main sources of that is competitive physical activity. It's one of the big ones. Engaging in activities that require concentration, for instance. Avoidant people also suppress awareness of their emotions, so they're not so aware that they're dysregulated, and they tend to attract people who regulate them, so that they don't necessarily have a conscious experience of that. When they move toward earn security and collaboration, they begin to mentalize that and begin to allow into consciousness the awareness of their emotions, and then develop the skill to regulate themselves, but also develop the capacity to be in relationships with other people who are regulating. Preoccupied people are dependent on external regulators, and the habit is to enmesh into the mind state of the other person and to regulate them. And because the empathetic experience is their primary emotional experience and their own emotional experience is secondary, they feel regulated when they're enmeshed with somebody else who's regulated, and they don't feel regulated when they're not. And so the process then is to turn your attention away from the enmeshing and focus on your own emotional states, which then brings your own emotional states into the foreground and pushes the empathetic experience of the other person into secondary position. And then to examine the emotional regulation skills you may already have, or what is more often what's required is the development of emotional regulation strategies that you can apply to yourself, but then also begin to pay attention to who's regulating for you, and to begin to develop your society, your social network of regulators, so that they're available to you. That making sense? So the challenge for preoccupied people is there's more mentalizing that has to be developed, and there's more basic emotional regulation skills that need to be developed in order to begin that process. The big hindrance for preoccupied people is the reliance on pretend mode. So there's also a need to begin to express authentically what your experience is, which also supports the exploration, because if you can't explore, which is what is affecting most preoccupied people, then the expression of your exploration that you've been making is pretending. You're pretending to explore, and then you're expressing your pretend exploration. And so you have to come into the capacity to express authentically. And then that would mean that you're expressing that you don't explore very well in the beginning, and the willingness to do that, which is actually the hardest, I would guess, the hardest part of it. Because if you're used to pretending to explore and presenting your exploration in a way that gathers a response, even though it's all pretend, to move to exploring and then expressing a not very capable capacity for exploration, you're not going to elicit necessarily the same response that you might have when you were pretending. And to really see clearly that even though it's not as developed, it's authentic, and that's much preferable to the more elaborated pretend. Makes sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
You know, one way to talk about it is primary exploration is really the place of the authentic self, the authentic expression of self. And pretend exploration is the place of the false self. And a lot of us in our culture, in order to fit in, particularly if the depending on the pressures in the family system against your authentic expression, we get really good at the false self. This false self is quite accomplished, but at the back end of all of that is this deficit of meaning, which is, as over the course of a lifetime becomes a deeper and deeper sense of despair at being alive, which goes away if you can move yourself into primary exploration, because you're engaged in actually the things that mean something to you, not necessarily cultural or even across the smaller societies. Is that making sense? All right. Why don't we do some meditation? And we'll focus on mentalizing a little bit, but do a little bit of concentration. So go ahead and settle in. All right. Let go of the meditation. How's that? Good. Huh?
So the last piece was interesting. I thought it was just one event to another event. What's there to notice?
Say a little more.
Oh, I was just curious, what am I noticing in the last step of the mind? I know there's, yes, attention would move pretty rapidly, but there's only events. I mean, it's hard to say there's attention. It's just events, and then second event, and then third event.
Right. Sometimes what you'll notice is that the mind just jumps. Sometimes more than one sense object will appear, and then the mind will sort of have some question about where it's going to flow, or it will begin to flow in one direction and then flow in another. Sometimes there's something that pops and the attention just moves. And so that's what you're really beginning to notice. And then the flow of energy is really toward preferred objects. And so when there's more than one at the same time, you can begin to notice that the mind really has a preference of one thing over another. You can see that process of curation as it creates what it's sampling in order to create the experience of reality.
One of these sense objects. So like,
Right.
for me, it's like seeing is a lot more. And sometimes when the eyes are open, there is this not daydreaming, but the eyes would get identified with space.
Yeah.
It's very common with eyes open.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Someone else? All right. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to have this half day long on exploration, where we're going to go more deeply into the advanced mentalizing. And then I'm going to try and relate it to the work I've done over my life. And I'll bring some visual examples in for that, so that you have a visual representation of what I'm talking about, rather than these sort of florid descriptions. And then we've decided to add a half day long in November, which I'm calling Family Archaeology, home for the holidays, as an attachment exploration. So that we could talk about how to go home and watch what's unfolding as an insight into the nature of your attachment conditioning, and how to actually be able to relate to it, so it doesn't just trigger you into a state of non-mentalizing. And then we'll come to the end of the year as it goes. So anyway, thanks a lot for your practice. I offer the teaching freely. If you can make a donation, it's much appreciated. There's a link on the website to do that. Appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
So, thank you. Bye.